Howdy. I haven't posted a video in a few days because of the weather and the power outages and stuff we've had in Texas. It's been kind of crazy. Things are starting to return to normal, so I thought I'd go ahead and make a video. It was actually a good place for me to take a break because we are right in the middle of a whole series that I'm doing on, I'm basically making an argument for Christianity, and we are at the halfway point. You can call everything that I did in the previous 38 or so posts as part one, and that was all philosophical arguments. Everything else I'm going to talk about is going to be historical arguments, and we can call that part two. There'll be a little philosophy in there because I have to deal with the subject of miracles and David Hume and all that, all that jazz. So got minimal notes today. So since this is the beginning of part two, let me just reiterate why this channel exists, why I'm doing things the way I'm doing them. I'm not using a whole lot of notes and stuff like that because what I'm trying to do is get better at speaking off the top of my head, being able to keep my train of thought, being able to think while I speak. And I'm trying not to do it with the crutch of anything like a teleprompter. So I'm not using notes or outlines and stuff. I have on a few videos made very brief outlines and stuff, and today is no exception, just very brief stuff. So we're going to get into historical arguments, and this is all going to be focused on, I'm going to talk about Judaism broadly speaking, and I'm going to talk about Judaism leading up to the first century. I'm going to talk about Jesus and stuff. And what I wanted to talk about today and tomorrow is I wanted to talk about the whole history of Israel from, the Davidic dynasty all the way up to the first century AD. Just to give you some background information going into historical Jesus stuff. But before I do that, I want to talk about the Bible, because the Bible is our primary source of historical information about that period. It's not our sole source of information. We also have Egyptian records, Babylonian records, Assyrian records, Greek records, Roman records. We got all kinds of stuff. But it's Josephus. We also have Josephus and Philo of Alexandria. So we have a lot of information about how things were leading up to the first century. As I was thinking, I think what I'm going to do today is talk mostly about the Bible as a source of historical information. And as I was thinking about everything I wanted to talk about today, it just kept getting longer and longer and longer. So I don't know whether I'm going to do this all in one video or not. But let's give it a go, shall we? So there's a couple of questions that sometimes get put to me. One is, do you take the Bible literally? And the other is the Bible historical? And there's also a couple of statements that I frequently hear, that the Bible is a translation of a translation of a translation, or it's based on copies of copies of copies, and so we can't really know what was originally said. So the topics that I want to address in this video and possibly the next video is the structure of the Bible, what's actually in the Bible, what kind of literature is it, and two, I want to talk about whether any of it is historical, whether it's reliable, whether it's literal, and two, whether it's been accurately preserved, and three or four, I don't know what number I'm on, 5, I don't know, whether we have good translations of it. Those are all important topics and stuff, and so there's a lot of them. I don't know if I'm going to be able to cover them. Let me start with the whole, is it historical and is it literal? Those are kind of wrong-headed questions. They're based on this assumption that the Bible is this monolithic book, by one author, from start to finish, kind of like a novel or something like that. And that's not the case. The Bible is not one book. It's a library. It's a collection of books. If I went into the library and I asked the librarian, is the library literal? She would probably look at me really funny. Or if I said, is the library historical? She may say, well, the history section is. Some of the other stuff isn't. The science section, maybe there's some history in there. I don't know. The fiction section is not historical. I mean, there's some historical fiction, I guess. So basically, when you go to the library, there's all kinds of genres. There's even how-to books, and there's poetry. It's just all kinds of stuff. And the Bible's the same way. But there are genres in the Bible that are not included in the Dewey Decimal System when you go to the library. So there's genres that existed in ancient times that we don't even really use today. We understand them and know about them because there are scholars who kind of keep up with that stuff. They study the languages and the cultures and the literature and all that kind of stuff. And so we can understand how these genres work. It's a bit murky in some areas. We don't have perfect understanding of everything. So the question of whether the Bible is historical is, well, some of it is. The history parts are historical. And the question of whether it's literal, well, some of it is. And then the next question is, well, how do you tell what's literal and what's not? Well, there's a bunch of answers to that question because there are different kinds of ways things can fail to be literal. If you were reading the sports page of a newspaper and it said, such and such team devoured this other team, well, you wouldn't take that literally. You would understand that devour just means they beat them badly. They won or whatever. So the Bible is the same way. I mean, there's some things that just kind of jump out at you like that you realize, well, that's just a metaphor or a wordplay or something like that. But there are broader categories of non-literal things in the Bible, like apocalyptic literature. And one of the reasons we can know is just understanding this genre and being able to recognize it when we see it, the way the genre of apocalyptic works. But in the case of the book of Revelation, which is an apocalyptic book from cover to cover, it just flat out tells you this such and such symbol stands for such and such. It gives you the interpretation, so it's not literal because it tells you it's not literal. And that's the case of some of the prophecies in the Old Testament too. It's the case in some of the parables that Jesus tells. The parables has a meaning behind it, a literal meaning behind it. The parable itself is not literally true. Some of it's more difficult, like the book of Job. I personally don't think that Job is a historical book. I think it's more like a fable. There's some people that disagree with me. There's a lot of people that agree with me. But that's not necessarily obvious. If you were just reading through the Bible, you wouldn't necessarily notice that. But Job is part of a genre called wisdom literature. And it's literature like Ecclesiastes and Proverbs. And some people think the letter to James in the New Testament is also wisdom literature. Some people think it's an epistle. So personally, I'm not really sure. I used to believe it was an epistle, and then when my pastor one day told us it's actually wisdom literature, which surprised me. I had never heard that before. So I haven't really looked into that one. I don't have an opinion about it. But let me just give you the broad overview. So that's the answer to the question of whether the Bible is literal and whether it's historical and stuff like that. Some of it is. I mean, the poetry is obviously some of the poetry, like the Psalms and stuff, it's poetry about historical stuff. So I mean, some of it is historical. Some of it's just praise, to the Lord. So that's not historical because it's not making any historical claims. Some of it, like the letters that Paul wrote, that is all. I mean, that's literal as far as it goes. I mean, like he's addressing, for example, the church in Corinth, and he says, I'm addressing a letter that I received from Chloe's people, and Chloe was one of the people that I guess that had a house that they were having a church there, and Chloe was like the owner of the house or whatever, and so those people sent him a letter, and he was responding to that letter. So, things like that. So let me just give a broad overview of the Bible, because I don't mean to insult anybody's intelligence by doing this, but the fact that people ask questions about whether the Bible's literal and whether it's historical kind of makes me feel like I ought to give kind of a Bible 101 thing. And since we're already 9 minutes in, goodness, I expected to get a lot more. Since we're already 9 minutes in, I guess I'll address this thing, and then I'll do the other stuff in another video. I'm trying to keep these videos in bite-sized pieces. But basically, the Bible is, Bible means book, by the way. the Protestant canon consists of what we call the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is everything that was written before Jesus. The New Testament is everything that was written after Jesus. The word testament is kind of similar to the word covenant, and that's where the word came from. So in the Old Testament, what the Jewish people call the Tanakh, they're the same material, but they're in a different order because, boy, I don't know how much detail I should go into here. So let me just say that they consist of the 5 books of law, or the 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch, or the Torah. They're all the same thing. It's basically Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And those books, tell the story of the creation and Noah's Ark, the patriarchs, Abraham and the 12 patriarchs, and then the in slavery in Egypt, and then the Exodus, and then Moses becomes like the prophet, and God gives his law to the Israelites through Moses, and that's like supposedly the beginning of Judaism. There's debate about when Judaism started, or what you should call Judaism, whatever. But anyway, so after that, you've got books like Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings. These are all books of history. And so I'm going to give a history of Judaism later on. But then after that, you've got major and minor prophets. Jeremiah and Isaiah would be like major prophets, and then like Hosea and Haggai, stuff like that. Those are minor prophets. At least that's the way the Protestant or the Christian Old Testament canon is divided. The Tanakh is divided between what they call the Torah, the writings, and the prophets, and they're arranged in different order. And one difference between the Tanakh and the Christian Old Testament is Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah are 2 distinct books in the Protestant Old Testament, but in the Tanakh, I think they're one book. And there's also the Catholics have what Protestants call the Apocrypha, and I think they call it deuterocanonical books, and those include things like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which was the story of what was happening in Israel about 160 years before Jesus came around, the Maccabean crisis. I'm going to talk about that later. There's some other books in there. There's an addition to the book of Daniel. Daniel is an apocalyptic book in the Old Testament. There's an addition in the Apocrypha called the Bell and the Dragon. I think there's one other story in there. So that's the Old Testament. The New Testament consists of what was written by Jesus's followers and their followers and stuff after Jesus came around. So the first ones are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and those are what we call the Gospels, and they're basically stories about the ministry of Jesus, and they talk about his death and his resurrection. And then you got the book of Acts, and the book of Acts was written by the same author as the book of Luke, and that talks about starting from right after Jesus' resurrection and before he ascended to heaven, and then it goes all the way till around the year. Jesus died around the year 30, he died around the year 30. Some people say 33. Some people go as far as early as 26. But I don't think anybody goes later than 33. But most people say 30, right around 30. And so the earliest, well, let me talk about the book of Acts. So the book of Acts is like the history of the early church from about 30 up until around, I guess, the early 60s, possibly as late as the mid 60s, because the book of Acts ends before the first war between the Jews and the Romans, which started in 66. So Acts tells the story between 30 and 66. We don't know how really late it was. Anywho, after that, you've got the letters of Paul. In the New Testament, there are 13 letters attributed to Paul. If you're a Bible-believing Christian like I am, you'll believe that all 13 of them were written by Paul. But if you're a scholar and you're not concerned about canonicity and biblical inspiration and all that kind of stuff, The scholars say that there are 7 of those books that they call them the Undisputed letters of Paul. It means that nobody disputes that these letters actually came from a historical person named Paul. He actually wrote them. And the other ones are accepted or rejected to varying degrees among scholars. If you get on the internet and you try to talk to somebody about this, they'll say, oh, there's only 7 authentic letters of Paul. The rest of them are spurious. Well, that's not the case, or it may not be the case. The real case is that there are 7 undisputed letters, and the rest of them are accepted and rejected to varying degrees of certainty among different scholars. Some people accept them, some people reject them. So let me see if I got these memorized. There's Romans. These are the authentic letters of Paul. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians. There's 1 Thessalonians, Philemon. Oh, I'm missing one. It's not Colossians, I don't think. I don't remember. But anyway, so for the sake of this whole series, it doesn't matter whether the books are inspired. When we call the Bible is what we call the canon. Canon means rule or law, and this is based on it was arrived at based on the idea that God inspired these writings, and so these are the ones we consider to be authoritative for the sake of being believing Christians. But if you're doing history, you don't really worry about whether something's canonical or not. All you worry about is whether, it gets back to the earliest sources. Well, you want to look at the earliest sources you can and the sources that are closest to the events that they describe as you can. Well, in the case of the New Testament, the books that are canonical actually are the best historical information we have about the early church and about Jesus and stuff. There are a ton of other Gospels that you may have heard about, but they're all 2nd century and later. A lot of those Gospels are Gnostic Gospels, and Gnosticism was kind of a 2nd century phenomenon. There's one, the Gospel of Thomas, that's very popular, that a handful of scholars think at least some of the material in there dated to as early as the 50s. John Dominic Crossing being one of the more well-known ones. I don't think that there's a big following on that in the scholarly community. I think most people take Thomas to be a 2nd century composition, and other ones like the Gospel of Judas. They found a bunch of Gnostic Gospels in Nag Hammadi, I think in the 1940s, either 43 or 47 or somewhere around there. That was around the same time they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we'll talk about that later. But anyway, so there's like a ton of these Gospels and stuff. But even the Gnostic Christians of the 2nd century and later never considered any of those books to be canonical. There is one, Marcion, who considered the Gospel of Luke to be canonical, but even that, he truncated it and stuff. So it's not just a matter of the fact that the Orthodox Christians won, and that's why we have the canon we do. We have the canon we do because those books are the earliest ones. They date closest to Jesus, and they're the ones that historians use. They don't use the later Gnostic ones and stuff. Those never were candidates for canonicity, whether you were Orthodox or unorthodox. It didn't matter. So besides the Gospels and the letters of Paul, you also had, the letter from James, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, Jude, and then you've got the book of Revelation, which is an apocalyptic one, attributed to a John, and nobody's really certain which John it was, because there were different Johns. There was John the Apostle, there was a John who was an elder, and there's debate about who wrote what. There's also the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, which is anonymous. A lot of the stuff in there sounds a lot like things that Paul would have said, so some people speculate that it may have been written by a close associate of Paul. There's a handful of people who think it was written by Paul himself. I personally don't think that. Maybe somebody like Barnabas, who was a companion of Paul's, maybe even Timothy, who knows? I don't know. As far as the Gospels that or the letters by Paul that are disputed, there's Ephesians, Colossians. I think a lot of people think Colossians was written by Paul, and a lot of people think Ephesians was written by Paul too. But as far as the Pastoral Epistles, these are 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Very few people think those are authentic, usually just more conservative scholars. I personally think they're all authentic. But I think 1 Timothy, I'm fairly certain was authentic. was written by Paul. Anywho, there's Peter, there's 1st and 2nd Peter. So anyway, that's the New Testament. And so as far as making historical arguments, I'm going to try to stick with the undisputed letters of Paul and the Gospels. That will make up most of my historical arguments. As far as the Gospels go, most people think that Mark was written first. Mark is the shortest one. That's part of the reason they think it was written first. The other reason is because almost everything that's in Mark is also in Matthew and Luke. And when it's in Matthew and Luke, they're in the same order that they are in Mark. And when Matthew and Luke add additional material, then they're not in order. They're not in the same order. So those are just a couple of reasons that people think that Mark was written first. There are some people that think that Matthew was written first, and that's actually the traditional view. It's not a view I hold. I personally believe that Mark was written first. Most scholars date Mark to around between 66 and 70. And the reason for that is because in Mark 13, Jesus is making a prophecy that sounds a lot like the war that was going on between the Jews and the Romans, with the whole siege of Jerusalem and everything. But they don't think that it was written any later than 70, because at the end of 70, the temple was destroyed and it was just a big mess. And all the stuff that Jesus said was going to happen, that's when he was going to sit on a throne and the Son of Man was going to come down and God was going to make his presence known, and that was going to be the wrapping up of history. That didn't happen. And so people say, well, it couldn't have been later than, Mark couldn't have been written later than 70. So there's an obvious literary dependence between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And also, part of the argument for Mark being written no earlier than 60s is simply, just the presupposition that Jesus obviously couldn't have made an accurate prophecy. Now, even if that's true, even if you go with that presupposition, I don't think that necessarily is any reason to doubt that it was written earlier than 60, because there were a lot of people that were predicting that this was going to happen. I mean, there was a lot of events that happened in the 1st century that if you were just a halfway intelligent person, you could tell that there was that Rome and the Jews were on a collision course, and there was going to be a big conflict, and probably the Romans were just going to come in there and smash everything up because they had done stuff like that before. They were conquerors. And so even if Jesus had just been an ordinary mortal, he could have easily predicted that something like that was going to happen. So I don't think the argument for that late of a date for Mark is really that strong. So there are a lot of conservative scholars that date it earlier, and the reason is because we know that Acts was written later than Luke, and Acts ends before that war. And so a lot of conservative scholars think, well, it must have ended there because the war hadn't happened yet. And so Acts was written before the war. And since Luke was written before Acts, it had to have come even earlier. And since Luke used Mark as a source, Mark had to be even earlier. So Mark is dated to like the 50s or something like that, according to some conservative scholars. I think that's possible, but I don't think it's a particularly strong argument. So as far as I'm concerned, Mark could have been written anywhere between 50 and 70, something like that. But anywho, there's an obvious literary dependence between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you put them side by side, you can tell that they have a lot of the same material in common. It's often word for word. Sometimes you can tell that there's little changes, minor changes here and there. Sometimes, one of them will shorten. Pericope is what they call them, these little episodes. Sometimes they'll lengthen them. So there's this thing called the synoptic problem. The Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels because of this literary dependence that they obviously have. And so the synoptic problem is the problem of trying to figure out what that literary relationship is. And the most popular solution to it is called the two-source hypothesis. This is the idea that Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a source. But besides Mark, Matthew and Luke also have a lot of material that in common that's not found in Mark. And they believe that Matthew and Luke were written independently of each other. So to account for this information they share in common that's not found in Mark, there's this hypothetical source they call Q, and Q comes from the German word Quell, or I don't know how to pronounce it, Quelle, which means source. And so almost all of this material in Q is supposedly a saying source. It's just the sayings of Jesus, and there's not a whole lot of narrative. There is, I think, maybe 1/3 of it is narrative. The rest of it is sayings. But it's really hard to reconstruct Q. There have been attempts to reconstruct Q, but if you go to my blog and you look up a book review I did on Burton Mack's book, Q, the Christian Origins or something, I don't remember the name of the book. Anyway, I went into detail about the synoptic problem. So that's the two-source hypothesis, and according to the two-source hypothesis, John is independent of the synoptic Gospels. So under this scenario, you would have, in the Gospels, you would have at least 3 sources. You would have Mark, then you would have Q, and you would have John. So that's 3 independent sources to the historical Jesus. And then if you add Paul, that's a 4th independent source. According to E.P. Sanders, Paul's letters were not gathered together into like a collection or whatever until towards the end of the 1st century. So the authors of the Gospels probably were not familiar with all of Paul's letters, and Paul obviously couldn't have been familiar with the Gospels because he wrote them before the Gospels were written. So Paul is considered to be independent of the Gospels. So that gives us 4 independent sources for the historical Jesus. That's according to the two-source hypothesis. There's also the fairer hypothesis, which is not held by quite as many scholars, but I think it's a pretty good theory. It's kind of the one I personally lean towards, although I'm not certain of it. But this is the idea that Mark was written first, and Matthew used Mark as a source, and then Luke wrote his gospel, and he used both Matthew and Mark as sources. Now that dispenses with any need for Q, because now you can account for the material shared between Matthew and Luke on the supposition that Luke used Matthew, so you don't need Q or whatever. And the thing about Q is just a hypothetical document, and nobody's ever found a document that matches Q. Some people think that there's precedent for such a document, since the Gospel of Thomas is almost entirely a sayings gospel. So there's precedent for there being such a thing as a sayings gospel, or a sayings source anyway. But nobody's found any Q, and so nobody knows. In the beginning of Luke's gospel, he says, "Many have undertaken to write an account of the things that happened among us, just as they were handed down from the beginning, from those who were eyewitnesses, blah, blah, blah. And it seemed good for me also to write to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know the certainty of the things you've been taught." Something along those lines. So you get the impression from Luke's gospel, when he says many have undertaken, that it had to have been more than 2 people. It couldn't have been just Mark and Matthew. So there were, in my opinion, there were probably other gospels floating around that just haven't survived. They just were not preserved. And so I think that if you really were to reconstruct the literary relationship between all the Gospels, it would probably be a little bit more nuanced than what we can reconstruct just with the 4 Gospels we have. I do think Mark was written first. I think Luke and Matthew both used Mark as a source. I think probably, although I'm not certain, Luke used Matthew as a source, but I'm not going to hang my hat on that. But Matthew and Luke also have additional information that's not found in either one of the Gospels. So people call those M and L respectively, and some people consider those, even more sources or independent sources. But you get the impression Luke's the only gospel that talks, that says anything about sources. He mentions all these previous sources. And he claims they were handed down from eyewitnesses, but he's the only one that makes any kind of statement like that. The closest thing to that among the Gospels is probably John's Gospel, where John says, towards the end of the Gospel, it says, all these things were written down by the disciple whom Jesus loved, who the Gospel never names, but who we kind of get the assumption that he's talking about the Apostle John. It never explicitly says that, but you can use deduction or whatever to kind of figure that out. But so whoever wrote that at the end, probably was not John himself. So I get the impression when I read that that John, or at least the author of this ending of John, believes that the Apostle John wrote all this stuff, and they believed his testimony, and so there's adding this thing towards the end. And it says something like, these things were written down so that you might believe, but probably if everything Jesus did was written down, there wouldn't be enough libraries in the world to contain all the books that would be written. Apparently he did a lot of stuff. So those are the only two books that say anything about sources. Now, in the case of John, most scholars think John was written latest. They think it was written as late as the 90s. Matthew and Luke are typically dated in the 80s because if Mark was written around 70, there had to be time for Mark to circulate before Matthew and Luke could write their Gospels. And since John was the latest Gospel, it was written in the 90s. A long time ago, like maybe 100 years ago, scholars dated these Gospels even later. Like Luke used to be dated around 120, and I know of one scholar living today who still believes Luke was written around 120, L. Michael White at the University of Texas at Austin. And the only reason I know about that is because I took two of his classes. Well, I took one of his classes. I audited the other one. I was just sitting here editing the video, and I realized that I lost my train of thought at this point. What I was going to say is that one of the reasons that scholars no longer date the Gospels as late as they used to, especially the Gospel of John, is because they found this papyri that dates to 120, and it's a little fragment of John's Gospel. Well, if we've got a fragment of John's Gospel from 120, obviously the Gospel couldn't have been written later than that. So that pushed, the Gospels, and since John was considered to be the latest Gospel, it was placed in the 90s, and then all the other Gospels got pushed even earlier. Anyway, that's all I had to say. But most scholars think it was written in the 80s. John was the latest Gospel written in the 90s, supposedly. Personally, I think whoever wrote the bulk of John's Gospel had to have been alive, at least alive, and an adult probably, before the war with Rome. And the reason is because there's a lot of geographical information in the Gospel of John concerning Jerusalem that was all buried under rubble during that war. For example, it talks about the Pool of Siloam, and it describes it with the 5 porticos and all this kind of stuff. And for a long time, we didn't even know that thing existed until the 20th century when archaeologists dug it up and found that it was just like John described. So that's just one example. There's a lot of details in John's Gospel about the geography of Jerusalem before that war. So I think whoever wrote that had to have been familiar with the geography before that war. And so that puts an upper limit on how late John's Gospel could be. I personally think it was early. I think it was earlier than the 90s. The reason a lot of scholars date it later is just this assumption that high Christology, which is attributing titles to Jesus in a lofty way, was something that developed over time. And since John has the highest Christology, it talks the most overtly about Jesus being God himself. And it's very theological. The other ones are kind of like dry and historical. John's is very flowery and theological, and it makes Jesus out to be more blunt and forthcoming with who he is. John's really concentrated on who Jesus is. Matthew's, concentrates on what Jesus taught, especially his ethical teachings and his parables and things like that. Luke is really concerned with chronological order, and Luke has a lot more background historical information. His is a little bit more sophisticated. Mark's is a little bit more crude. The Greek in Mark seems to be written by somebody for whom Greek is not necessarily their native language. And there's a lot more Hebrew words or Aramaic words in Mark's Gospel. Sometimes it'll give you the Aramaic word, and it'll give you the translation of the word. So that's another reason a lot of people think Mark was written earliest, because Jesus' primary language was probably Aramaic, and the same thing is true of his followers. But everything in the New Testament was written in Greek. The Papias, who existed, I think, in the 2nd century, but we don't have anything that he wrote. But Eusebius claims that Papias claimed that Matthew wrote the oracles of Jesus in the Hebrew language. So some people think Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. I personally do not think that. For one, because there are certain word plays in Matthew that work in Greek but don't work in Hebrew, like the camel going through the eye of the needle kind of thing. You'll have to look that up. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but I think it's fairly certain that Matthew was written in Greek. So I don't know what Papias was talking about. Maybe he was talking about some saying source that came from Matthew or a disciple of Matthew's. Maybe the Gospel of Matthew was based on whatever document Papias was referring to. I don't know. But I don't think Papias was referring to the Gospel of Matthew that we know today. Or if he was, he was simply mistaken. So yeah, everything in the New Testament was written in Greek. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say. I guess that's about it as far as the Old and the New Testament and stuff. The next time I talk, or the next time I post a video, I guess I will talk about the preservation of the New Testament, how we got the New Testament we have today. So I'll talk about translations, and I'll talk about textual criticism, things like that. And I'll probably at some point talk about the genre of the Gospels as well. I'm going to go ahead and talk about that right now. Who cares if it's 35 minutes in? So it used to be that there was a lot of debate about the genre of the Gospels. Are they, some people called them religious documents. Some people thought they were a genre all their own. Some people said that they were midrash. What were the other ones? Pesher. I think Barbara Thiering said they were Pesher. John Shelby Spong still thinks they're midrash, but that's kind of an outdated point of view. In the 1970s, there was this guy named Richard Burridge who wrote this book called What Are the Gospels? And he argued in there that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies, or sometimes called ancient biographies. And he showed this by comparing the Gospels to a lot of other known Gospels, not Gospels, but biographies. And for example, Plutarch wrote a whole bunch of what we call the lives of Plutarch, and they were about a bunch of Roman characters like Caesar Augustus. Did he write about Caesar Augustus? I don't know. Mark Antony, all these Cassius, all these different Roman characters and stuff. And so he makes all these comparisons. And Plutarch was not the only one. There were some other biographers. But anyway, he made all these comparisons, and he persuaded the majority of scholars that the Gospels are ancient biographies. That's their genre. And so that's the view I hold as well. After reading about him, I haven't read Burridge's book, but I've read a lot of people who have commented on Burridge's book, like Bart Ehrman has commented on it, N.T. Wright has commented on it, and both of them have claimed that this consensus that exists now about the genre of the Gospels is all attributable to Richard Burridge. That is on my Amazon wish list, so I plan to get that book pretty soon. So anywho, there you go. That's all I have to say for today. Thanks for listening. Stay warm. Psych, I'm still here. I want to say just a little bit more about Paul's letters. So in the New Testament, it starts with Romans, and it goes to 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, etc. Now, the way they're ordered in the New Testament is not according to the date in which they were written. They're all ordered according to length. So Romans is the longest one, and then it goes down to, I think, Second Thessalonians, I think, is the shortest one. I don't remember for sure. But anywho, all of Paul's letters were written between around the late 40s, like 48, 49, up until like the early 60s. If the Pastoral Epistles are written by Paul, then the latest date you can give them is like the early 60s or something, because the last we know about Paul comes from the book of Acts. And according to Acts, he was arrested and he was sent to Rome, and then he was under house arrest for 2 years. So this happened in the mid 60s, probably, no later than 66, because that's when the war started. So the last letter he wrote was the letter to the Romans, and he was writing, most of these letters he's writing to churches that live in these different towns. So the Corinthians was written to the Christians who lived in Corinth. Galatians, well, that's the Christians in Galatia. Some of them are written to individuals. The one written to Philemon, that's actually the shortest one, Philemon. Philemon was written to an individual. The Pastoral Epistles were also written to individuals. 2 of them were written to Timothy, and 1 of them was written to Titus, and those were companions of Paul. So most of these letters are kind of occasional. So they were written, for some special occasion. Sometimes, like in the case of the First Thessalonians, he had founded this church in Thessalonica. And he and Timothy or whoever his companions were traveling somewhere else to go start other churches. And he got a little bit concerned about him. And he sent Timothy back with this letter to check up on them, see how they're doing. So Timothy took that letter with him. In the case of 1 Corinthians, that was written in response to a letter that he received from the Christians at Corinth. So most of these churches are like individual churches. Now, in case of most of these letters were written to individual churches. So the letter to the Ephesians, there's some doubt about whether that was actually written to the church in Ephesus, because there's a manuscript we have where Ephesus is written in the margin, and so there's a little bit of dispute about whether that belonged in the original or not. Apparently, some scribe thought it was. But 2 Corinthians, some scholars think 2 Corinthians is actually a combination of 2 separate letters that were just kind of like melded together by a scribe at some point when they were copying. Some people think it consists of as many as 6 letters. Personally, I think at most 2. But probably not even that, probably just 1 letter. But I don't really know for certain about that. But nobody disputes that Paul wrote it. I mean, the whole 2 Corinthians was written by Paul. So Romans is the only one that was not written to a church that Paul himself founded. He had never been to Rome. He wrote the letter to the Romans because he wanted to go visit them, and he just kind of wanted to introduce himself and lay out in a systematic way what his theology, what is the gospel that he is teaching, what's his message and stuff. So Romans is my favorite book, and it's one of the best books in the New Testament because it's the closest thing to a systematic theology. Paul just lays it all out. It is sometimes hard to follow, but the more you read and study and stuff, the more stuff starts to click, and it's really interesting if you're into that kind of thing, which I am. So yeah, that's all I had to say about that. Thank you for coming.